Welcome everyone to this year's Albert Hungchow-Hong's annual lecture. My name is Helen Lansdowne and I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives. This is the best time of the year for us. Each year the Center is able to bring on campus a distinguished scholar to address a community audience on a topic of current public interest in the Asia Pacific region. And this is all thanks to an endowment that was set up by Dr. Albert Hungchow-Hong, a benefactor of the University of Victoria, and a strong supporter in the importance of education. The inaugural Albert Hungchow-Hong lecture was presented in 2007 by Dr. James Scott from Yale. That was followed by Carmen Hinton from George Mason. And then we had Dilsoni Karaniko from the University of the South Pacific. And this year we have our next distinguished speaker. A firm believer in the importance of education, Dr. Hong has also generously supported a scholarship program at the university and is very happy to be helping students through scholarships that can be offered on a perpetual basis. He noted, "I believe the true meaning of this matter lies in how young people can be helped in the future." This year's Hong Lecture is also serving as the keynote lecture for the conference Deparochializing Political Theory that started this morning, first exciting day of the 3-day program. Now, to help me introduce this year's Hung speaker, I welcome to the podium our Provost, Vice President Academic, Dr. Professor Rita Tremblay.
It's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's keynote speaker. But before I do so, please allow me to say a few words about the theme of this conference, Deparochializing Political Theory, a topic and theme dear to my heart. A theme which suggests many engaging inquiries. For example, how in a new global intellectual environment in which diverse philosophical and political traditions are increasingly in contact with one another, how can we develop a shared understanding of the concept of the critical among Western and non-Western scholars? And how can we highlight the need for a continued dialogue oriented to a deeper understanding of existing ideas and approaches? Within this context, while some are motivated by democratic or post-colonial concerns, emphasizing the inclusion of subaltern voices in a global conversation about political life, others have turned to existing scholarship in area studies to build alternative methodological foundations for political inquiry. Others, through a problem-driven methodology, have been able to engage with the prevailing hegemonic paradigms and polarized debates, whether these happen to be theories of modernization, nation-building, society-centered models versus state-centered models, rational choice versus qualitative political science, area studies versus comparative politics of global model. In a similar vein, while some point to the creation of a new cosmopolitan hybrid perspective through the introduction of deliberative democracy and an egalitarian cross-cultural conversation, irreducible to any of the cultural categories that originally informed it, others celebrate the development of indigenous, non-Western categories and scholarships. Others, like Homi Bhabha, caution us that the beyond is neither a new horizon, nor a leaving behind of the past. Beginnings and endings may be the sustaining bits of the middle years, but in the famous siècle, we find ourselves in the moment of transit where space and time cross to produce complex figures of difference and identity, past and present, inside and outside, inclusion and exclusion. For there is a sense of disorientation, a disturbance of direction in the beyond. Whatever their goals or motivations, however, all these scholars generally believe that the inclusion of non-Western texts, voices, and traditions in North American classrooms and scholarships is a necessary step if political theory is to remain relevant in today's global world. This conference is precisely addressing these concerns and themes. How one can go beyond the parochial in a sensitive, authoritative, and influential manner. Now let me introduce today's keynote speaker, Prasenjit Duara. It is my great pleasure to honor and welcome a great personal friend to this conference, particularly the University of Victoria. We've known each other for a long time. I say I was a mere child, and Prasenjit was a mature young man. I used to call him Uncle High Tea. You can see he's grayed, I'm still dark. I'll tell you my secrets, okay? But seriously, it's a great pleasure to see you here and welcome you. Professor Prasenjit Duara is a Raffles Professor of Humanities, the Director of Asia Research Institute, and the Director of Humanities and Social Science Research at the National University of Singapore. He received his PhD from Harvard University in History and East Asian Languages and has taught at Princeton, George Mason, Stanford, and the University of Chicago. He's an internationally recognized historian of China. His recent publications include the global and regional in China and nation formation. Intercommunication has been one of the great themes of Prasenjit's work. Indeed, his talk tonight will bear precisely upon the circulation of political ideas and the fact that those circulations have not simply conformed to national boundaries. This is a theme which, as you might have guessed, is very close to my heart. I'm therefore delighted to present Professor Prasenjit Duara to you. The topic of his lecture today is Histories and Competitive Societies, Temporal Foundations for Global Theory. Please welcome Prasenjit.
Thank you very much, Rita. Rita always had a way of getting one up, right? This time my age.
He's acting everything.
So I have to press something that tells me, but what is it that I have to press? Okay, thank you. Okay, I hope you can see. Which says competitive temporalities and historical societies, the circulation of the early model, which is a slightly different topic, but that's okay, we'll move away from that. But I did, okay, that's better. I just want to, first of all, thank all the hosts here. First, Rita, for such a generous introduction and for hosting me. Of course, Helen Lansdowne, who has also contributed in many ways. Lee Jacob, who's the reason for my being here. And Jeremy Weber, who's been very, is he here? Oh, there you go, yeah. Who has been very supportive, and we've initiated our discussions in the process of my of this visit. Intellectual discussions, that is. And to all the others, especially the staff who have worked very hard for this conference. And I also want to thank the kind of capacious thinking that went behind this conference and the series that you had that had the I don't know if it's wisdom, but something like that, to invite an historian to this conference on political theory. And I think actually it's wisdom, because I think this is actually, I call it often a tectonic moment in many ways. Well, all moments are probably tectonic for somebody or the other, but I think for humanities and social sciences, as well as for the global shift and so on, but I think humanities and social sciences has had all kinds of intellectual and institutional problems, and many parts of the world. And there's a busy rethinking. I think we've sort of ended the old Humboldtian model of humanistic learning and the way of organizing knowledge production in the university. And we're entering some phase that is not very friendly to humanistic and interpretive social sciences. So I do think it's very important for us to get together and think collectively about how how we can respond to this new moment. And so I do think that the interdisciplinary activity is very important and germane at this point. So what I'm going to present today is, a lot of it is actually in those 2-paragraph summary, if you had a chance to read it, which was very helpfully rewritten for me by Helen to make it much less academic than it was originally. But I want to work out some of the things. I'm still not going to read the paper, which does have some technical discussion and so on, and probably bore you. But I'm going to just use the PowerPoint for the whole lecture, and it has some very nice pictures, so kept awake. I know this is. I guess it's quite often that I give talks after people have a few drinks, and usually that works out well. But sometimes people get a little, if they drink too much, then they get a little aggressive. That's okay. This talk is the first chapter of a book that I am writing that I hope will be completed next year. And so a lot of it may have loose ends that I can easily attribute to the rest of the book. And we can continue discussion there. And the book is called, I like the title, I don't yet have the book, but I have the title. It's called Transcendence in a Secular Age, a Secular World, which is obviously a theme that everybody is working on. The global modernity and the non-Abrahamic traditions of Asia. And the idea is to think about what this tectonic moment is going to sort of portend and what it can deliver, possibly. Okay, so this is on the historical, and the two main themes of the book are circulation and circulatory movements of knowledge and of historical activities and historical practices, and the other term is transcendence. And in a way, you can think of it also as things circulate, but also things sort of deepen within a certain tradition. And that has been, from the perspective of big history, I think that can serve as a very basic and sort of set of terms to understand different developments. Okay, so let me then launch on to this topic. What are the goals of this talk on historical temporalities? Well, there have, as we know, been multiple modes of conceptualizing the passage of time in most societies. You have cosmological, mythological, natural, just natural cycles and so on. And what I want to do is explore the relationship between the historical, which one can think of as evidentiary practices in the view of the past, and other, which is not necessarily non-evidential, but where the evidentiary is not necessarily the most important way of describing an allegiance to certain aspects of the past. Now, histories of communities, actually, in the modern sense of history, of evidentiary history, did exist in earlier societies. I think there's no question that it did. But I think they coexisted with other temporalities, and the principal thrust of what I'm going to try to argue is when the evidentiary mode becomes not only the dominant and hegemonic mode, but in some ways becomes the new cosmology, that things begin to change very importantly in how we think of time. So the question is, how and when does the historical become hegemonic, and what happens to the other modes with which it had, in fact, coexisted in earlier times? And a very important second question that I take up is not simply the idea of a linear history which emerges at this time, but a history that is a bounded, that is necessarily a bounded history, a tunneled history. It's always a history of a community that is that becomes written at the expense of other modes of circulation of events and their effects. And I use the early modern world as an optic to view the reality of circulatory events and practices together with coexisting temporalities. So in a sense, the early modern period, to the extent that we can identify such a period, is perhaps one of the last ones that we had where in fact there was this kind of coexistence. And I'll try and think of our present sort of era in the 21st century in terms of that type of temporality, or that type of coexisting temporality. So can the early modern be a resource for developing the coexistence of local and cosmopolitan histories, so necessary, and here is my ultimate goal, so necessary for planetary sustainability. So I am the touchstone in the end from the standards by which I judge things happens to be sustainability. Okay, so I initially begin with a discussion of narrative, and I recognize with Paul Ricoeur that there is such a thing as historicality, which he develops from Heidegger and others, as a mode of time. And what he does so well is show how narrativity and the whole idea of narrative is very well suited for this historicality, which is sort of the idea of reaching back to the past of a community or of a group in order to move forward in a certain direction. Now, so it's sort of the narrativity is the human need to reach back into our past, to change our future and see life as a whole. As such, historical narrative always has this identity dimension. And in many cases, of course, you could have all kinds of modes that will reach back to the past in order to talk about the future. Mythic modes are very important ones, and legends and other kinds of expressions through ritual and so on. But you do also have written history in the evidentiary mode, more or less in different cultures, in different societies, at different times. Now, what Hayden White does is, this is an old debate, but I think it's relevant for us to understand what the conditions were. Hayden White draws very much from Paul Ricoeur, but he, of course, adds the power dimension, which is missing in Ricoeur, because the narrative is also a mode of exclusion, right? It excludes certain people and includes other people, and Hayden White goes on to talk about a people without history, right? Which was Eric Wolf's famous term, that they're automatically excluded in the largest narratives of the 19th century and around those centuries. So what Hayden White does is emphasize narrative construction. That it is not narrative for Ricoeur, it was in an earlier mode, later on he changed it, but was something that was found. And Hayden White, of course, says this is constructed, and it's constructed around what he calls an imagined central consciousness, right, which is projected back and forth and has a power dimension to it. But the problem, it seems to me, with Hayden White is that he does it very well, but then I think he is also trapped in some ways by the kind of structural thinking of his time. So the narratives that he talks about come from literary theory and has certain definitive structures, right? So you have the tragic historical narrative, the comic historical narrative, the comedic, the romantic, and it's very interesting to see that many national narratives do have some of these elements in combination and so on. But I think the problem with Hayden White is that precisely this idea of structure, that in fact it tends to foreclose the narrative, the possibilities of this narrative. What I want to argue is that historical events are actually, when a historical event takes place in the world, its immediate effect is to disperse. So you could have an imperialist victory somewhere, but 60 years later, somebody else somewhere else will decry it as a terrible event and will associate a different element that is more important for the construction of that people. Now, so imperialism gets overturned and so on. So there's a way in which historical events themselves are dispersed and not containable unless you want to contain them, right? And you know, we're beginning to see this now. I mean, I was thinking about how Japanese history is being rewritten through these collective historical projects and so on, and the UN has gotten involved, a lot of fourth world people are involved, Taiwanese Aboriginals and so on. And, you know, under certain situations, I can imagine that Japanese students will be reading textbooks that have been constructed by people that they colonized and coming back. And in some ways, that's also happening in the West, right? So, I mean, there's a way in which there's a sort of feedback, that there is a kind of a return, the revenge of the narrative, right? That sort of takes place. So both at the practical level, there's a dispersal, but there's a dispersal which is not homologous in the narrative. And you know, because narratives are also used for other purposes, even if it is by the subaltern, it will be used for something else. So, and then I just want to talk a little bit about this whole question of what I was began with, the idea of coexistence of different types of temporalities. So I certainly agree with the idea that pre-modern societies were not dominated by a sense of linear history, although they were more or less bound. This does not mean that the historical view did not exist, especially in the Chinese, Greek, and Indian tradition. You know, the Indian tradition has been notorious for being ahistorical, but recent work by very famous scholars like Ramana Thapar and others have shown that people have been looking at the wrong places. I mean, if you look at Brahmanical texts, they are against history. You know, they don't want history to intervene in their conception and their cosmology of the world. But if you look, for instance, at, say, Buddhist writings, and for writings of groups of people who are interested in demonstrating some kind of lineage with either existing rulers or with the history of the Sangha and so on, you get a lot of evidentiary accounts. And if you look at land grants and so on, so it's a whole different genre where you get it. And in a sense, this is itself a kind of coexistence, where the cosmological movement, the Brahmanical conception of time, which is Kalpic and enormous, subsumes a more practical sense of time, which does involve evidentiary claims. And as I'm trying to show, competitive elements do want to mobilize these kinds of competitive claims and show some kind of evidentiary basis. So you have this kind of coexistence, but they are always in some ways intertwined with the cosmological view of time in the pre-modern historical period. And quite often these are also, these evidentiary histories are developed by rulers, dynasties, sometimes in communities, but not very often whole communities. It was much more the aristocracy and so on who needed to demonstrate their superiority, their world superiority or the communal superiority and so on, or the superiority in the region, that necessitated this kind of evidentiary history. But I would say that this kind of evidentiary history was very much in a minor key and subordinated to the larger cosmological goal of transcendence, or in the Chinese case, of the age of the sage kings, right? So this sectionalism was subordinated always to a sense of a larger goal, a larger good, a larger God, greater than the self of the individual or the particular community or the lineage that was being described historically. The Chinese example is, I think, a very good one, because the Chinese, as you all know, had a very highly developed state apparatus, and they had an empire which was very literate and which was bureaucratized. And they had, in fact, people like Mr. Hobbesma and so on, argue that they had a notion of time that was based on chronological space-time, where you need, where different events in different parts of the empire or the known world at that time was coordinated around the idea of the scope of state power, and so related to that. And so they are understood in terms of each other. And you have strong records, and most of all, the case of Sima Qian, I think Michael Purett has shown. Sima Qian had also a very strong notion of innovation, that it was very important for the state to be able to move and adapt to the new circumstances. And this was is very much the goal of modern history, that history is something that does not repeat the past, that it adapts to, that it records the changes that have been taking place, progress. But the interesting thing that even this dominant Chinese view was subordinated very much to a notion of time in which the cosmological goals were supreme. So the idea was very much, and ironically, it is not a chronological, I mean, it's not a second order chronological thing that the later it gets in time, the more realist and scientific they become, because it's in the Song, which is also the period of great economic development and so on, that in fact the idea of the sage kings and the idea of returning to the ideals of the sage king, I think, become much more important, right? And so the notion of innovation is subordinated to the age of the sage kings and returning to those ideals in the goal and purpose of rule. And you could say that it was a reaction to all kinds of economic changes and so on. Whatever it was, you had a conception of time that did feel it was important to maintain the substantive goal of the cosmological, of the cosmology. Now, what makes the change? I think the change develops originally and in a sustained kind of way in Europe, and it has to do with the Renaissance and the rise of competitive states. In Europe, just to sort of truncate European history, I'll give you a little brief, my telegraphic view of it. I think Pocock did a very nice job in the Machiavellian moment, showing how what exactly it is that Machiavelli does that affects the notion of time that we have probably medieval to the Renaissance, and that is he talks about how the ruler, how Machiavelli and the ruler will borrow some kind of secular time from the true meaning of cosmological time, which is the time of God, to fulfill worldly goals of the ruler and to fulfill civic virtue, even while accepting that the true meaning of life and the world was expressed in virtue in the cosmological sense and the ecclesiastical sacraments and the time of God. So this is the kind of coexistence which makes a temporal division, right? So it's one where, okay, just give us this time and we'll fulfill some goals and so on, and then we'll go back to the time of God, right? And that'll become the main goal. But what happens, of course, is that the Renaissance itself begins to lead to the unraveling of the Christian empire and the formation of these competitive states, which then intensify this kind of worldly time much more. And the main motor of it, and here I move to people like McNeill and that whole group, is what he calls, what William McNeill calls fiscal militarism, which is when you have competitive states that are essentially driven by the logic, the motor of indebtedness to acquire for more resources. And that's a motor that sort of propels them in a kind of way that they cannot stop, and until you get overseas empires and all of these kinds of things. And I think that's a very important, even if it's not the whole truth, of understanding what happens to the state form. And what I want to argue here is that ultimately what happens is that the history of gods, history of kings and so on, begins to serve a different function, which is to mobilize all kinds of resources, including biopower, including human resources. History becomes a means to rally people in the competition for to see that they belong to one and are in competition with similarly constructed other state peoples. These are not yet nation states. And I think that Yes. Pocock actually does a very interesting kind of loop where he shows, he first does Machiavelli, and then he moves to Puritan America, where he shows ultimately that this idea of what does he call it? The kingdom on the hill, I think is that the word? The Christian ideal of bringing, can be actually found in this world, and leads to a kind of the linear expression of history in real time, and you find that God has actually descended into this universe, and America becomes the land for manifest destiny, right, where it is expressed. And that is where you begin to get, then finally you get the kind of movement where the transcendence to an individual God is itself transcendent, so you then left without religion and you left just with history. And so this is the kind of development that I'm going to lose my chair, I'm sorry. Okay, so fiscal militarism is the motor of competition. This also leads to a lot of overseas ventures at the same time. And this is also, very interestingly, the early modern period is also the time when the maritime trade in Asia is developing very extensively. And these early modern expansions, of course, changed the profile of maritime trade in Asia, which was largely not state-dominated, and begins to bring in new kinds of elements and this kind of competitive history that develops actually in the projects of European powers within the foreign territories, whether it's North America after the discovery of the Americas, or in Africa, or in Asia, Asian societies. Because very often what you have is that sovereignty, which was much more sort of fragmentary in Europe, begins over time to become more and more consolidated because of claims made overseas, by whether it's by royalist charters or by other groups and so on. And they say, okay, this is the property of this little duchy in Germany or something like that. And this has to be worked out in the courts in the European system. And this is the work, of course, of Lauren Bailey and others. And we begin to see how this expansion itself begins to then form notions of sovereignty within Europe. Okay, then moving to the 18th century, Koselleck, and I'm doing a kind of a genealogy, I would say, of this idea of competitive histories. Koselleck begins to show how Reinhard Koselleck, the German historian thinker, who says that linear time becomes firmly established in the 18th century when there begins to appear an increasing gap between what he says, experience and expectation. So he says, at the beginning of the 18th century, people expected to do the kinds of, lead the kinds of lives that their forefathers had led. At the end of the 18th century, they were beginning to expect something different, right? And so this sort of really begins to mark time as progressive and in a kind of linear kind of way, and this then begins to form the dominant view of time in European society. Competition becomes fully institutionalized, it seems to me, with the French Revolution, as disenchanted popular sovereignty becomes the basis of both state and nationalism becomes its goal. And of course, it also creates universal ideals, which become important, the ideals of humanitarianism and so on. But for much of the next 2 centuries, these ideals are mostly deferred. But I think we also have to remember the power of them later, because I think they're now much more powerful than they were at any time earlier. Now, as we know, national histories emerge to undergird the ideals of secular and popular sovereignty, while at the same time developing the nation into a competitive body, right? A sleek body that can compete, adapt, and acquire resources. But the interesting thing about nationalism, which by the late 19th century begins to spread all over the world, and certainly by the early 20th century, what happens is that you still need, although the ideal of nationalism is to sort of move to an uncharted future, right? Conquer, and linear history is to move because you have progress and you move ahead in time. But actually nationalism still has a very important dimension of the spiritual or the religious in some way, of the metaphysical at any rate. Because it still needs an authentic subject of history. That is, and what is the subject of history? It is none other than the name of the nation, right? Which acts as the actor in history. And so the nation is the territorially bounded entity that endures changes over time because it needs to claim sovereignty of some of the people on the land versus outsiders and people who cannot claim sovereignty within. So, and how is this bounded linearity achieved in the national history? It is achieved by one. Most national histories, if you look at it, are divided into three periods: the ancient, the medieval, and the modern. And then you have some kind of, the ideal is, of course, you want to reject the immediate past, which is called the medieval or the dark age or something, and reach back to a glorious ancient past, right? And often the way of doing that is the mode of the Renaissance, which allows you to reject the dark ages and go back. And if you look at any national history, you'll find that there's some figuration of that trope always, that you link back to the past. And this is in order to, and this is part of the creation of the national subject, which then allows you to also excise a lot of the stuff you don't want and move in time. So this is the national subject is, I think, a very important element that allows us to recognize that this history is not self-sufficient in both its linearity and its boundedness. Okay, and the way it does it is that, and it does in fact produce a whole what I call a regime, and it's the regime of authenticity. It is a regime that declares that if you don't, and it's a sacred regime, you trample on a flag, see what happens. And so the regime of authenticity of a nation is very critical to bounding, to policing its boundedness. And I'll show you some pictures here. Let me show you the picture, then I come back. Okay, now this is actually, no, I need to explain it. In the absence of the cosmological time of God, what happens is that progress becomes, to some extent, the kind of angel of history, right? It is what will give you progress, what will chart you through this uncharted time. And this was described very well by Walter Benjamin, who describes the angel of history, and we'll go and we'll see it, who seeks fruitlessly to pick up the shards from the destruction left by what history has done, by the scale of progress, right? And we can see what authenticity is. Authenticity may be the same angel turned forwards towards the uncharted, telling us that we have salvaged something essential about us that will carry us through our destiny at the end of history. So this is Angelus Novus, which is, I always thought that the painting was probably more angelic, but this is a Paul Klee painting about which Walter Benjamin has written this very famous description, which was then made, circulated by Ben Anderson and became very famous. Right? A clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel. His face is turned towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer clothe them. The storm irresistibly propels him towards the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. The storm is what we call progress. And then I have juxtaposed it with a painting of Manifest Destiny, which is, I see it very much as the same angel, but turned not towards the past, but turns towards the future in order to allow people to conquer other peoples and to make claims on the land, right? And just to show that it's not merely a Western thing, I'll show you some pictures from the Banaras map of Mother India. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it is very much Mother India as, I actually particularly like this picture of Gandhi with the 3 bullet wounds. This is taken directly probably from Pieta, right? The way it's being held. I mean, it's such a sacralization from circulatory modes of knowledge, right? I mean, you have this stuff that's going around. And then to show you the figures of the new figures of authenticity, the revival of the Yellow Emperor in China, and all the ritualism that now goes with it. So also, and the Yellow Emperor is not considered to be mythic, incidentally, by even the government of China, although there's very little ability to demonstrate it. But in fact, one of the most important historians in the first half of the 20th century, Hu Jiegang, was castigated by the Court for saying that the Yellow Emperor was a mythic figure. And right now the communists are also claiming that it was a real figure. So nationalism can only track history along its linear bounded path if people will, that is to say, which I think of, when you will something, you have a sacred regime, a regime of authenticity, to show daily, and this is from Renan, a famous quotation, that we are what you were, we will be what you are. So this is, I think, for me, I don't need any other demonstration to talk about identity and continuity. We can also understand now why identity politics and history as a creator of identity and recognition is so central to modern politics. Right? The role of history in specifying a collectivity has now turned from a subordinate role among temporal forms to the hegemonic form of temporality. Okay. Now, let me talk a little bit about what was actually happening. So this is, in a sense, the narrative of history, right? It is how people have narrated history in the powerful parts of the world, and become powerful partly because they have narrated it in such a way, right? I mean, that's the interesting part. But in reality, what was going on is that, of course, this is happening precisely at the time when, in fact, the world was becoming more circulatory than ever, right? This is Eurasia, in fact, according to Jack Goody, who I find a very important source for my thinking. According to Jack Goody, Eurasia has been an integrated region since the Bronze Age, since agriculture, since cities and trade routes. And there's been circulation of technology, biospecies, goods and knowledge, which actually began to accelerate, particularly from 1500s onwards. And the interesting thing, so what you get is these expanding circles of exchange that have been going on. I mean, it's a pulsating cycle, the circles, because sometimes, you withdraw and then you expand and you withdraw. But by and large, they have expanded. And the most important thing that happened in this last phase of the second millennium was, of course, in terms of this expanding cycle, was, of course, the opening of the American frontier, which changed the game. And it was at that point when Europeans became the agents of and controllers of that linkage of the whole North American and the Atlantic resources. It also changed the game in Asia. I mean, in the beginning, of course, it was all the silver from the Americas was going into pay for goods from China and India. But then gradually the Europeans became very dominant in the region and could change the terms of the trade, right? Silver becomes substituted with opium, political power in South Asia wipes out the textile competition. And so all of these things begin to happen. But the interesting thing is that all this while there are circulations going on. And I'll move very quickly to the 19th century. From the late 19th century, I think that what we consider in some ways to be, or until recently, was considered most distinctive, which is the nation and the nation form, was probably the most global entity. Nations were in fact modeled very much on each other, on powerful nations first, and modeled very much on each other. And not only was it their modeling, all the elements that went into a nation were also modeled on each other. And you have this, what I call cognitive globalization through the 19th century, where you have things like models of the hertz, which is, you know, an electrical unit, or anything else, or laws and so on, or even I always give the example of the child. The child, I remember, you know, obviously this took a while to cover, but when a child ceased to be a child at 5 or 6 in India and in many other agrarian societies, when they worked in the fields. But if you look at every constitution in the world, and the work of John Myers and others has been very helpful, a child is a child till 18, right? So there's the standardization everywhere, and everybody is adopting these same standards. And yet the interesting thing, of course, is that the nation claims to be unique. Why does it? It misrecognizes its globality and claims to be unique. Now, why does it do it? I think it does it because, first of all, in a competitive environment, in an anarchic world, there is no sovereign authority, there is no God, there is no cosmological authority. You have to constitute your own authority, right? And how do you constitute it? By claiming that something is yours. And by staving off, I mean, this can also be very important and good. It's anti-imperialism, right? You keep the imperialists at bay by claiming a certain kind of sovereignty. But you have to do that. And so you have to sort of develop your regime of authenticity, claiming that you're all part of one body, and that's what gives you the right to be sovereign. So, incidentally, I wrote a book called Sovereignty and Authenticity, so if you are interested in these questions, you may take a look at it. It's a whole big book. So what we have is a sort of mismatch between the nation and the world, right? So the world is increasingly global, but all these national histories are talking in terms of nationalities. And this mismatch, I think, has never been greater than it is today. And I think, once again, because no nation in the world is self-sufficient anymore. No one's wealth or poverty is based entirely on what happens in the nation. And although it's entirely global, but the institutions for remediation of any of this are at best national. Right? So in a sense, we have this mismatch where misrecognition allows the world to go on producing an increasingly unsustainable planet because of the type of mismatch between the political system and modes of resource use. So there's global degradation of the environment and the commons. So what I am recommending, of course, is that we need to replace the primacy of linear national histories with circulatory, interactive, and transformative histories. Local, regional, and national histories are not to be excluded, but analytical priority must be given to how these histories interact with the former entities. And this way we need to balance much more these issues. And you just take the example of Marxism in world history. You know, Marxism comes into China from the West and from Paris and from the Soviet Union. And, but it comes in, so it's something that's circulated in. It becomes transformed in China and comes out again into all different parts of the world. At present in my own country, in India, it's a very important political force, and God knows how it's being reshaped there. And so this is a very good example of, I think, a very simple example. And I think in particular, its knowledge forms, ideas are the ones that sort of circulate very rapidly and make and have tremendous effects all over. Now, in a way, we haven't really been able to think or even develop the vocabulary of this kind of circulatory histories. Because I mean, when we think of cycles, we think that they return to some similar point. But obviously I want to do something else. Therefore I call it circulatory rather than cyclical. And in fact, actually, it is conceptual artists and geometricians and others who do much a better treatment of how to think of circulations and change. And I have some pictures here for you too. This is the Mobius strip, and I just went online and found this stuff. You can have you know what a Mobius strip is, right? And it's one where it sort of it turns into itself and then comes out and rejoins. But then if you rotate the Mobius strip, it undergoes many more transformations before it rejoins. And then if you rotate it still more, in the case of integer numbers of inner rotations, we're getting tapes with two surfaces. In the case of the non-integer numbers, the inner rotation, we will get a tape with only one side. So the velocity of circulation itself makes different types of changes possible. Right? But this is still returning to the same point. I think these conceptual artists are much more interesting. And they show how, you have these connected points and these loops and circulations and so on. And that the important thing, I think, is not returning to the point, nor is it the notion of the spiral, but it's the question of the reference, right? Of returning to the reference. And I like this third one most of all, because you have a point at which these guys go around, and then they come back and they lead to another point, right? To another band that goes around. And so I think these are very interesting ways to allow us to think history anew, as it were, in terms of these kinds of references, circulations, spirals, that I think will enable us to think of much more cosmopolitan society. And by cosmopolitan here, I mean something that, I used to be very, very anti-nationalist. And I realize now that, you do need communities of some kind, and the national community has established itself, and you can't just. So at least to share sovereignty, when nations are prepared to recognize that there are all different levels of governance and arrangement and regulation that need, where you need to share this kind of sovereignty. So then I have, incidentally, there is a copy of the paper, and if anybody is interested, if the organizer is interested, I can send it. It may have a slightly different conclusion, but not in any substantive sense, just in an editorial sense. So I maybe, how about doing for time? I don't know. I have time.
Yeah, 10.
Okay. How much?
10.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll tell you a little bit then about the early modern. Victor Lieberman, I hate to sort of pick on someone. Actually, it's a very, very powerful book. Victor Lieberman is a very powerful historian at the University of Michigan. He has written a book which is the result of a lifetime of work called Strange Parallels. And it's a very impressive longue durée of study of several societies. And the interesting thing is that it's not just, Europe and China or, the dominant players that we've always sort of considered. He considers all kinds of stuff. He's himself a Burma specialist. So he looks at Bagan and Ayodhya in Thailand, France, Japan, China, Russia, India, and several others over the longue durée. And I mean, the guy has a lot of knowledge about all these places. And he shows that there were remarkably parallel developments right up to 1750. And but the problem with that, it remains very much within this paradigm of what I call the national modernization paradigm, that each one had these, and it very much yielding to ultimate competition, who sort of, makes it in this parallel race. It's very much like tracks on a race, right, in this competitive mode. And that's the problem with a lot of historical writing, that like it or not, even if you don't want to do it, you get caught in this competitive mode of presenting histories, right? And so, so I think there is, so that remains a problem with it. And yet there is in early modern history, historiography, an alternative tradition that is developing. I think a lot of people take inspiration from Jack Goody's work. There's, of course, Janet Upton-Wood, there's Jerry Bentley, who I'm very sorry to say passed away just last month. There's Sanjay Subramaniam, who talk about deep interconnections. Sanjay Subramaniam has this very interesting work on these ideas crossing through the early modern world, on what is the word, millenarianism, Christian millenarianism, Islamic millenarianism, all the way to Southeast Asia, and how it folds in with Sufi and South Asian stuff, and into China with the White Lotus and all of the Buddhist millenarianism. And all of a sudden, millenarianism sort of begins to appear at a certain time. And when you have actually, and you have a lot of dialogue of civilizations going on as well. Actually, I don't like that term at all, but you have a lot of dialogue going on when Akbar is now the Mughal emperor, talks to people from various traditions and tries to assess their relationships and their similarities and differences. And these are not sort of carried through as such, but there was a certain cosmopolitanism. And I think more and more people are showing that early modern Europe both depended upon and contributed to the early modern world, right? So, but I think there's no way in which early modern Europe can be understood without all of the contributions that were made. And if you look back at Buddhist theory is that circulation there, but there have also been periods where certain places have catalyzed tradition, have catalyzed certain innovations, right? So at different times, I mean, the Islamic world from the 9th century to the 15th century was a very important source of catalyzing many developments that came through the Eurasian exchange and leading to innovations and transformations. Similarly, by the 17th, 18th centuries, you had these innovations and transformations, but they were not by now. And recently, I haven't had a chance to look at the book. It just come out. Shankar Muthu. Shankar Muthu has a book which tries to argue that no thinker from the 18th or 19th century in Europe can be understood apart from the kind of the global circulations and global ideas that were going around. And so in a sense, they've been very much part of a unified world that is misrecognized and that is rejected in some ways as the basis of understanding. Okay, and we also have a lot of, I mean, this is more about trade and technology, and we see that even up to the 18th century, the Europeans had no overwhelming advantage. I mean, the people in Chinese studies know very well that Zhang Chenggong defeated the Dutch and threw them out of with actually much less power in some ways, but with superior military techniques and so on. The Dutch out of Taiwan. And we know that the Yanubis in Oman and the Marathas in the Indian Ocean often won their battles against the Portuguese and the Dutch and so on. In both bulk and value terms, Asian merchants carried the majority of world trade until 1760 or so. Early modern practices and technologies were shared in the space, especially in the maritime space. You begin to see in 18th century or is it 17th century? When does the Saku period get established in Japan? What is the date for Saku? Anyway, until then, the Japanese were navigating ships in the Pacific region and so on, using these portolans, which were very hybrid sort of forms of these Portuguese with but only the Japanese technologists could sort of manipulate them. But they had very composite, these ships were made up of people from many different cultures, many different societies, and the technology was used a lot, and a lot of it was from Chang'e's voyage and so on, the technology that mixed in with European navigation techniques. And there was, of course, at this time also an enormous expansion of the cultures of common cultures of travel, framework of religious debates, and others in Asia. So, conclusion one. What implications does my position on circulatory histories have for deprovincializing political theory? First, the obvious one is that I wish to reject the paradigm of national modernization histories and rethink the early modern world as a collective, interactive, and polycentric heritage for the globalized present. Second, it becomes very difficult, I think, once you have this kind of history, to own any ideas. Right? No nation owns an idea. No culture really owns an idea. I was just thinking, I hope I don't offend anyone here, but now there's all this work going on the Achaemenid Empire, which was the first Eurasian empire in the 6th century, in present-day Persia and all over that region, all the way down to Sudan in Africa and so on. And they had their notion of history. They had at least two interesting ideas, which then circulated to the other Abrahamic traditions and elsewhere. One was the idea of empire itself informed very much the Alexandrian and the post-Greek, the late Greek and the Roman notions of empire. But the idea of a chosen people was, which was later adopted by the Jews, was originally an Achaemenid idea. And of course, the Jews of the ancient world were very admiring of their enemies because they had liberated them from the Egyptians, right? And the idea of the chosen people very much is also a circulatory idea from there. The idea of paradise, the Achaemenids had this notion of paradise where they brought basically all the different flora and fauna from all the different parts of their empire and said this is ultimately heaven on earth, what we now call. And this notion of paradise then gets also absorbed into different kinds of ideas. So, this kind of thing has been going on for a long time. And as I said, I think a case can be made that perhaps the most rapidly circulating and transforming material is ideas, whether as theory or simply as thought. Now, in another essay, which would be chapter 2, in another chapter, I call it the historical logics of post-Western modernity. I argue that there's a very strong tension between popular, avowedly circulatory cultures, which are often cultures of efficacy, right? Gods are adopted, even in the ancient world. Very rapidly, you find Egyptian gods in parts of Bengal by the 7th century because they're fertility goddesses. And they are efficacious. And so they circulate all over the place. But this is popular culture, right? They don't care where it comes from and so on. And then you have these high cultures, right? Purifying high cultures, whatever they are, right? Orthodox Brahmanism, Confucianism, Protestantism, nationalism, even modernization theory, I think. The latter is high-minded, disciplinary, and sacrificing, originally of the self, of others as well, right? Present cultures can be sacrificed for modernity. The former is often, as I said, gratificatory and personalized. Historically, there are reasons to believe that high or axial cultures have also circulated since antiquity, but have unquestionably been in mutual interaction between different high cultures as well, whether as reactions or as influences since the early modern period. I think we have this it's very clear right now. But by the cognitive globalization of the 19th century, I think we have no pure civilization anymore. Everybody is adapting to the dominant ideas of what it means to be a good civilization. But at the same time, my argument, since I do have an argument about transcendence, is that high culture has historically been the most important source of transcendent authority, which is capable of challenging entrenched interests, including contemporary capitalist and nationalist movements. These are the other two logics. Cultural logic is one with political logic. Yeah. And this kind of high culture we see all the way to the running of reserve battery power. I'm also finishing my battery. So, you know, high culture, you can think of these sort of transcendent-based high cultures like Buddhism, Marxism, I think, utopian transcendence, Gaia, and all of these, I think, are very important sort of things. But, of course, we cannot afford to reify or sacralize them excessively. I mean, there was some discussion earlier today which didn't get picked up, but I wanted to make a reference to it. I think ideals like humanitarianism, sustainability, etc. are modern universalisms which require a kind of transcendent utopianism. The real question is how to combine rational procedures with the kind of cathexis and commitment required of transformation. How does one play the games of truth? This actually sounds terrible, but Foucault, I think, elaborated on this in the last years of his life, very interestingly, whereby experience is converted into truth, right? And I think this becomes a very important development in our time. The eye of history, our present subjectivity, must be linked to different temporalities, from natural and geological ones to those of local ecologies, from rapidly changing capitalist production cycles to which we are always adapting, right? What's the next professional move we have to make and things like that. So let's not deny that we are also influenced by these cycles. But at the same time, we also have to be tied to rhythms of sustainable institutions, practices, and modes of life. Insistence on separate territorial cultures needs to be replaced by the emphasis on different temporal cosmologies. We need the weak exclusivity of pre-modern or early modern history, but only because national societies are now increasingly unable to manage the escalating crises generated by self-induced risk society of modern nations and the sustainability of the planet. Okay, thank you.